but I think, Thomas, if okay with you, I think we're good to start.
Yeah, thanks, Ross, for these introductory remarks regarding the technical issues. I hope everybody will kind of manage to raise the hand, which is very supportive for having a lively discussion. So with that, I welcome everybody to the June 2021 CAG meeting. I hope all of you are doing okay and everybody is healthy and in good shape. It's very unfortunate again that we are meeting in a virtual space only, but with all the numbers going in the right direction, at least in the countries I know about, I think we can have the hope to kind of at some point in time in the future to meet in person again. So at least myself, I'm impatiently waiting for that, to see you all back in person. Looking quickly at the agenda, we have after the introductory remarks and after a quick look at the minutes from last meeting, we have 3 topics really on the agenda. The first one is the IPSASB Program Technical Director's report on the work plan, and I know that Ross is also kind of including some remarks regarding the mid-period work program review into that. And then we have 2 major topics from a technical perspective on our agenda today. One is natural resources, and the second one is a project I think we are all keen to contribute to, which is the revenue and transfer expenses project, with the focus on transfer expenses for this meeting. And I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion in that. I think you all remember that we promised you that you will have the opportunity to discuss details regarding the concept and the approach. In the first discussion we had more overarching issues to be discussed, but today we have the opportunity to go more into detail. So with that, any remarks regarding the agenda? Okay, if that's not the case, then I suggest that we jump immediately into agenda item 1, which is review and approval of the December 2020 CAG minutes. Anybody having remarks regarding the minutes as drafted? Okay, I don't see any raised hands. I hope it's not because you don't find the function. So I assume you don't have any remarks, and with that, I take the minutes as approved. And that leads us already into agenda item 2. And with that, Ross, happy to give the floor to you and to present to us the technical director's report and the CAG report back as well.
Thank you, Thomas. I've got a couple of quick slides. And you can see we've got a new fancy slide template for the IPSASB that we're debuting this time. So if it looks a little more modern and new, I hope everybody likes it. So in agenda item 2, I outline a number of changes to the work program reflected since the last time we met in December. And I just wanted to run through those relatively quickly to remind CAG members of the progress that the IPSASB's made since the December CAG meeting. So on the first slide here, you can see on the left-hand side the substantial number of exposure drafts that have been approved since December 2020. So the first one, ED75 leases and the request for information on concessionary leases and other arrangements similar to leases. That was approved in December 2020 and published in January 2021. And the comment date was actually middle of May. So the staff are now working through those responses. And we'll be bringing that back for a first discussion with the IPSASB at the July check-in meeting. In December, the board also provisionally approved ED76 through ED79, which are a package of exposure drafts related to the measurement project that the CAG discussed several times in 2020 and 2019. Those were finalized at the February 2021 check-in meeting and published in April 2021. And I did want to highlight that October 25th is the comment end date. And if any of these topics are of interest to you, your organizations, or in your jurisdictions, please encourage comments and respond. We're really excited to get this package of measurement exposure drafts out, and we want to get as much engagement around the world as possible from constituents. So urging CAG members to please help us and spread the word. If you have any questions or you're looking for the documents, please send me an email and I'll help you out.
Can I make it just a short comment regarding that, Ross? As a first reaction, we had already, and I'm just wondering whether this could be the case for other members as well. We had an internal discussion within our Institute of Chartered Accountants in Germany regarding responding to the comment letters, responding to the ETs with comment letters. And the first reaction was, and that is would be a little bit a shame that members of the working group thought it would be kind of quite a lot to work on, and probably they would kind of tend to comment on the EDs in the order as they are. Obviously, 76 and 77 would work together, so probably it makes only sense to kind of comment to both. This is already very extensive, but really highly important because of the overarching importance. Then members said, okay, property, plant and equipment could be important as well. So if we find the time, we would like to respond to that as well. And ED 79 tends to fall a little bit under the table, let's say, because they said, okay, it might be less controversial, it might be less important compared to the others. And given the workload of the 4 comment letters to be prepared, we tend not to answer to ED 79. So I hope that's not the case across the world, because if that would be the case, then you probably will not receive a lot regarding ED 79. Just to kind of give you a short reaction on how the workload was perceived by the German Institute.
Thanks, Thomas. I see Catherine has her hand up as well, but maybe just a quick reminder from, responding to your point, Thomas, that the IPSASB did give a longer consultation period for this. Our normal consultation period is 4 months. We actually gave 6 to deal with that, and we provided a little bit of run-up time to our posting as well. So we're trying to deal with that, but do appreciate that it's a lot of volume of work. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I know I explained that to the people as well, but actually there is July and August in the midst of the reporting period. So people say, okay, it's actually the net time is probably not 6 months, but I know. Just wanted to warn you that you might see a little bit lesser respondents to ED 79 due to this. Catherine.
Well, just to follow up on that, I mean, it is true that we have a similar reaction to some extent at our institute as well, where I'm involved in it. What we try to do, though, is to make sure that we do try to respond to all of the documents if we can, but we probably will emphasize only those areas which have got specific points that are relevant to us, but would at least try to give a general flavour of our support or otherwise. So, we are trying to do it, but we have got similar issues, I think, to the ones that Thomas is outlining.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, Ross, sorry for interrupting, but I thought it would be good to kind of bring that point in at this stage.
No problem at all, thanks. Just let me share my screen again. And changes that I wanted to highlight since the March IPSASB meeting, so more recent changes are the proposed extensions to revenue and transfer expenses, leases, and natural resources that the IPSASB will actually be discussing at its meeting in the coming days. And for a little bit of background on those changes, we've kind of noticed that since the pandemic began and we moved to virtual, From a staff perspective and a board perspective, we'd been operating in emergency mode where we were kind of pulling out all the stops to change our working model and keep the projects working and moving. But we hadn't really made significant adjustments to the timelines on any major projects. We had deferred some projects to give the board more opportunity to discuss things, and we had put some things on hold. But our key projects were kind of been pushing quite strongly to try and make sure we meet our deadlines. And in the last couple months, we've noticed that the stress of the pandemic, the board operating virtually, that we just weren't making the progress that we'd anticipated on the timelines, particularly on revenue and transfer expenses. And we're seeing that on natural resources as well. So there's specific proposals on revenue and transfer expenses to extend the timeline from the end of this year through to the mid 2022 to complete those two standards. The board still plans to try and finalize the authoritative text by the end of 2021. So that'll be the core text and the application guidance, and then work on the non-authoritative material for the first half of 2022. The leases timeline, there's two reasons for the change there. We gave a little bit of extra time to a number of constituents who were struggling to get their responses in right by the deadline. So that impacted whether we could bring back leases for a proper response in June. So we had to adjust the timelines anyway for that. But we also noted that when we took a real good look at it and thought about working virtually for the balance, at least the next couple meetings, that we might not be able to make the progress that we'd set out to do. So we thought this was the time to adjust the timeline there. So the board will be considering that as well. And natural resources, we haven't proposed any specific changes for that timeline yet, but we have highlighted that it's looking like the September approval is a bit of a long shot, and the board will revisit that at the end of the meeting based on progress throughout the meeting on whether or not we'll adjust the timeline, but it's highly likely we'll have to put that back as well for the approval of the consultation paper. And some upcoming consultations that are quite important that I wanted to highlight. And the big one is the mid-period work program consultation. And again, thanks to CAG members for their recent input at the May check-in meeting. The staff found that very, very helpful in working through the document and highlighting the changes, the various different groups we'd spoken to. But the CAG input was quite helpful and has helped shape the final document that the board will approve this week. And in the program technical director's report, I think it's appendix 2.5, you can see the full report back of the comments we received from the CAG and how we've adjusted the draft document for the board, the final that the board will look at this week. And I just wanted to thank the CAG for that input, as well as the input during our initial discussion in December 2020. The CAG has had a big impact on the shaping of the program, or sorry, the work program consultation, and just wanted to extend those thanks from staff. Again, Dave Warren has been working on that, and he asked me to extend the same thanks from him.
Yeah.
And again, sorry, Thomas.
Yeah, Ross, let me just echo this thanks and give it back to you and to staff for responding to the wish of the CAG to have the opportunity to kind of look at the draft version of the consultation paper and provide the input before the IPSASB board meeting. I think that was extremely valuable for us as well to get our foot into the door and kind of before it will be approved and discussed and approved by the board, to have the opportunity to provide input. So thanks for your flexibility as in that as well. I know it always puts additional burden on staff organizing these meetings, because it's not done with only having 1 hour discussion. There's preparation and there's work afterwards needed. So thanks for that as well.
No problem at all, and we're happy to have those meetings when needed. And I think it was quite helpful in getting the document where it needs to be. Just wanted to highlight that we will be holding a number of regional roundtables while the document's out for consultation. We expect to publish it sometime in mid-July of 2021, and it's planned to be open for comment until mid to late November 2021. And we will be working with regional partners again, like we did a few years ago when we did the strategy consultation, to engage with constituents in various parts of the world. At last count, I think we were planning around 6 or 7 virtual events with different partners spanning the globe, where we're looking to get direct feedback on the proposals. We'll probably also have some feedback on some of the other consultations that are outstanding at the same time. So it won't just be work program consultation focused, but that will be the main priority. And I just, again, wanted to urge people to have their organizations or regions respond if at all possible, and to please help us make sure that people are aware that the consultation is going on. When we publish the document, we will have a bit of a toolkit available for anybody who wants it. That'll have the documents in it, a slide deck, and some press information that we'll share with the CAG members to pass around their jurisdictions if that helps create awareness. The last thing I wanted to highlight before opening it up for full comment is just what I call other updates, and just to highlight that the board will be approving some changes to the non-authoritative portions of IPSASB borrowing costs. There were very strong support on the consultation on this. There's no changes to the actual authoritative guidance in the standard. It's just adding additional examples to help with the application of IPSASB in the public sector, and no significant issues were highlighted in the comments received. So I just wanted to make the CAG aware of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Ross, for these introductory remarks. Before I open up the discussion, Ian, anything you want to add from the chair's perspective?
Thanks, Thomas. No, I think Ross has given a very good overview, very comprehensive. So nothing I'd want to add at this stage. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Ian. So with that, I think you have listened to Ross. You have seen the paper, agenda item 2. Any comments, any questions regarding the consultation papers, the consultation process, or the report back regarding how the board and staff reacted to contributions of CAG and CAG members? Okay, Ross, I think people seem to be quite happy with both your presentation and the paper, which is a very good signal.
Good job by Dave, I would say.
Okay, so please provide our thanks to Dave for that as well. All right, with that, okay, then I think we saved some time, which we could use for other topics. Thanks, Ross, very efficient. And with that, I think we can move on then already to the next agenda item, which is agenda topic 3, natural resources. You probably all remember that we already had the first discussion, which was quite interesting, when we had a more general discussion about kind of how to approach the project in more general terms, how to manage probably expectations being out there with constituents, how to kind of be consistent with similar questions like the right to tax or other related topics. Now we want to dive a little bit deeper into the topic, and Edwin has prepared the agenda item. And as I know, Edwin has also prepared some slides. So Edwin, over to you to kind of introduce this topic to us.
Thanks, Thomas. Let me start sharing my slide. Okay, so we have just one short paper for natural resources, but there are 2 quite hefty issues in the papers. So I'll start with the first one. And so a bit of background on this paper. We've revised the general description of natural resources since the last CAG meeting. And specifically, we've now narrowed it down to items that have the 3 attributes that you see on the slide. So natural resources are described as items which are naturally occurring. By that, we mean existing without human action. And the second attribute is that these items still remain in their natural state. And for that, we have expanded the text to explain that for subsoil resources, they remain in their natural state if they're not extracted. For living resources, we've clarified that remaining in its natural state means that they have not been harvested, or their natural biological transformation has not been interfered with human intervention. And for water, similar to subsoil resources, we've clarified that remaining in its natural state means that it has not been extracted. Okay. We've also clarified that the natural resource is the underlying physical item, and it is not in any way the same as the activities that are performed. So activities such as development of the natural resource or the cost of extracting these resources are accounted for separately and technically are not part of the scope of this project. Okay. And the last thing is, we've also clarified that the last attribute is natural resources have to be a resource as described in the IPSASB's framework. So that's no different from what it was before at the last CAG meeting, but we have actually expanded the explanatory text to say that a resource is an item that's capable of generating economic benefits or have service potential. Okay. And I guess, so the what we have proposed in the CP is if an item meets the description of natural resources and it meets the recognition criteria from the conceptual framework to be recognized as an asset, then those items should be recognized as assets in the financial statements. And we've also clarified in the CP that if the items do not meet the recognition criteria, but they still fit into the description of natural resources, then the task force agreed that the information on these items should be disclosed. And we haven't really landed on whether it's disclosures in the financial statements themselves or as supplemental information. But right now the CP leaves the door open and says we should consider both note disclosures and supplemental information in the broader general purpose financial reports. And by that, we give examples of applying the IPSASB's recommended practice guidelines to provide such information. So the two questions for the CAG on the first issue is, well, the first question, do you agree with the proposed general description of natural resources? And the second question is, do you foresee any challenges to the approach that we have described on this slide, i.e. recognize natural resources that meet the recognition criteria, and for the ones that do not meet the recognition criteria, we would provide information in the notes or in supplemental information. So I'll stop there now and let the CAG comment on these two questions.
Yeah, thanks, Edwin, for these the first presentation or the first issue. I could imagine that the questions are somehow interrelated, but perhaps we can, for the moment, try to focus on the first question, which is kind of the definition or the description of what is natural resources. I see two hands, Catherine first, and then Fabienne, please.
So I'm broadly supportive of the approach. I think it's a good one. I think the thing that concerns me is that it is the point that you've just made, Thomas, that the two things are interconnected, and it's almost there's almost a risk of confusing the definition of natural resources, some of which might be recognised assets, some of which might be unrecognised, with the what are the criteria for recognition point. So I think it's going to be important to just keep looping back to make sure that it is going to work properly in that context. But I think as a starter, I think it's a good place to start from.
Thanks, Catherine. Fabienne?
Thank you, Thomas. I just wanted to start, if I may, with a more general comment, maybe. I think that from a public interest perspective, the natural resources project is very important. First, in the current context of increasing need to report on sustainability, and we see that this is booming. And second, in that it might help promoting the use of accrual-based accounting principles. And in that sense, I think that transparency and accountability, as stated in paragraph 1 of paper agenda item 3.1, may be seen as a bit vague on the overall objectives, and I was wondering whether it could be useful to emphasize somewhere in the consultation paper that the project is also important for managing public finances and especially identifying public finance risks where natural resources are concerned. That's a thought I had when I read the agenda item. Now, back to the question, to the very question. In terms of scope for the project, I'm sort of a bit concerned that the 3 proposed attributes leave the scope widely open. As to the disclosure requirements for those natural resources that cannot be recognized, where would the board draw a line between those natural resources that should be disclosed in the notes to the financial statements or in GPFRs, and those items that are not worth reporting? For instance, should all rivers be listed in the notes or in GPFRs? Because that they might probably fit the 3 attributes. In other words, I'm not sure how, in practice, the assessment of the service potential or of the generation of economic benefits of a natural item may help decide when a natural item becomes a natural resource. So those are my questions on them.
Thanks, Fabienne, for that. Can we park this second or this last remark for the second question? At the moment, I would want to focus on the first question, which is the clarity of the description and whether it's helpful or not. But I think it's obviously very important remark. So if you could bring that back, if you forget it, please, that would be helpful when we talk about question number 2. Edwin, first reaction regarding clarification of the objective of the project and the scope. Anything you want to...
So we do talk about PFM in the consultation paper. It's just not summarized in the agenda paper that was presented to the CAG. And I don't have the exact wording on me, but I think we talk about how the goal of the project is to come up with a standard or attempt to come up with an accounting standard, which would result in information that can be used for better management of public finances. So that is in the consultation paper.
Perfect. Fine. Thanks, Edwin. So with that, Anwar and then Tim.
I was just wondering, in terms of the description, whether we might as well add one more phrase to say that subject to depletion through use or extraction. It says it's naturally occurring and remains in its natural state. Once the process starts, then of course there may be changes which will bring about differences in the amount that was initially expected, and also the amount after the depletion or use.
Thanks, Anwar. Edwin, any response to that?
We didn't talk about depletion explicitly because our thought was that once an item is no longer natural or in its natural state, it would be covered by another IPSASB. So for example, if you have something like ore that is extracted, that would become inventory. And I guess we kind of made the assumption that if you were converting a natural resource to inventory, that would result in some kind of decrease to the natural resource. But I can see where you're coming from. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Edwin. I see some questions coming up in the chat. I would prefer if we can bring this up orally, because I think it's a little bit complex to kind of deal with parallel discussions here orally and in the chat. So please provide your questions by speaking up and raising your hand. Tim, and then Franz.
Hi, and thank you. For me, the definition makes sense, but I think I just wanted to take a little bit of a step back and say what the consequence of this may be, because let's say, you know, we think that this natural resources project is crucial for issues, let's say, in the world of climate change. And one of the things one is trying to do, let's say, is account for our carbon assets. And so when you're looking at what's naturally occurring and what is not naturally occurring, let's say in terms of forests that distinguish between naturally occurring forests and managed forests, how does one, there's a distinction between the two, but then in terms of the financial reporting, how is one talking about all the public sector carbon assets, for instance? And how is that being brought together in the financial statements once one has made this distinction? Because there is a concern that this may become fragmented in terms of financial reporting and then there are issues, again, similar issues around natural resources like water, where some of this is naturally occurring and others is not, and how do we account holistically as well as individually in terms of making this distinction for these naturally occurring assets, and in relation to this in terms of making a better decision making as the public sector. So it's important to have this distinction, but how is one bringing this together as well?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I think you're fully right, and I think it's getting even more complicated as some assets are changing their status from naturally occurring to not naturally occurring when they are like harvested or whatever. So kind of there is a stage in between, and the question is, where do you make this distinction? And at the end, I think you have to bring all information together to get, as you said, this holistic picture. Franz, and then Jeffrey.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm also supportive of the description in paragraph 7, but then I wonder about paragraph 9, where the scope is then limited to subsoil resources, living resources, and water, which is much narrower. Basically narrowing it down to fossil fuels and hydroelectric power, maybe from the water. Shouldn't the paper also at least mention things like solar energy, wind? Sunlight and wind are also resources that are sustainable and should at least be mentioned, because some governments have much more of it than others.
Thanks, Franz. I think this is a little bit contradictory to what we recommended in the first discussion, which we had at the CAG level, because we recommended the board to kind of focus on some aspects in order to kind of being not create too kind of large expectations out there that nearly everything would kind of appear at the balance sheet. I think probably, and Ian can jump in here, and Edwin as well, it might be discussed in the further proceeding of the project, but at the beginning, I think we recommended as well to narrow the scope in order to keep it manageable. But I think Ian and Edwin can respond better to that.
Well, I think my first comment would be exactly the one that you've made, Thomas. In the approach that we took to this was to provide the definition, and I think when you see where staff have developed the draft consultation paper, you will see that there is a separate chapter which discusses the issues, the generic issues with accounting for natural resources. And then essentially what it's doing is highlighting the fact that in the project at the moment, we're using 3 examples. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't apply the general principles to other types of possible asset, but it's actually really trying to be clear about what can go on the balance sheet at this point in time. And I think that's where the whole issue about what is a resource and what can be recognised becomes really important, because actually the more you get into this project, it's likely to be about what is not recognised on the balance sheet. It's much more than about the disclosure issue. Now, this is where we've also got to be very careful not to try and deal with all the issues involved in climate change. The whole issue around sustainability reporting is incredibly important. It's certainly a very active area. We know that there is a very live proposal to create an international sustainability standards board sitting underneath the IFRS Foundation, bringing together a lot of the existing guidance that's out there, and we are participating in that. We're an observer on the CEO group that's looking at the arrangements into that. But at this stage, we are not trying to get ahead of that debate. We're not trying to create new guidance. We're not saying that you can't use existing guidance. And indeed, the IPSASB has relevant guidance in terms of our guidance on service performance reporting. And also, when you bring together the non-financial aspects, actually recommended practice guideline 1 on financial sustainability is going to be relevant. But in this project, whilst it fits within that bigger picture, we're just being very careful that we are talking about natural resources and setting out the principles for accounting for natural resources and exploring that through the 3 examples. So we're not limiting the application of those principles to other types of natural resource, but we are trying to make this manageable and deliverable. And there is a very real risk, and we've seen this with a number of projects, that by trying to get too comprehensive, trying to deal with everything, actually you end up dealing with nothing, because you just can't deliver the project. And so that's what we're trying to do with this. But I do want to underline that we do take the issues associated with sustainability reporting, climate change and so on, very seriously. And you can see in the consultation paper how we're proposing to work in that space, even although those aren't, this natural resources is focusing on a very particular area.
Thanks, Ian. I think that was very clear and very helpful. Jeffrey, I know you have been waiting very patiently. Please come in.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I was quite excited to read this definition of natural resources, but then slightly disappointed when I did, because it more or less tells me that they're natural and they're resources. And I was expecting it somehow to go a little bit further. And then just a couple of points on the formulation. I think the second one talks about remains in a natural state, or remains natural or whatever. And I think remains might be a slightly difficult word. It works in English, but when you start translating it, it can actually mean something perhaps a little bit different. So not sure why it's not just is in its natural state. And then in terms of the human intervention, I think one of these aspects is water. I think water never changes whatever you do with it. You just move it around and you make it available, or you do something with it. So somehow I'm not quite sure whether that works, or whether that works in the same way. And just the last point, I live in Luxembourg and we're surrounded by forest, and I go walking with my dogs every morning in the forest. And it's very difficult to actually determine which parts of that have something to do with human intervention, and when that took place. If something was planted 40 or 50 years ago, is that still human intervention? So I think, that perhaps requires a little bit of thought as well. And at what point that kicks in. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. I think that echoes a little bit the impression I had when I was reading 7 and 9, especially. I think the devil lies in the detail here, especially when it comes to things like forests or water. I thought as well about kind of the example where water is collected in artificial lakes. Is that kind of, is that still water or is it not water because it's collected in an artificial lake, which is obviously human intervention? What about rivers when they are kind of like corrected or changed in their flow? What happens to the water in these rivers? So I think probably more examples, more thoughts in detail are needed. Chai and then Key.
Yeah, thank you for also presenting this. I think I agree with a lot of the things that has been said. This is a very important project, especially given the fast development that we are seeing on the sustainability reporting and climate reporting related. So I think my comment actually, I was also mentioned similar to what Tim and Jeffrey has said about remains in natural state, what that means, and is that clear enough, because I think it works well for subsoil, but I think as Thomas, you mentioned for forest land, it's more ambiguous. And also given that, we are trying to recognize natural resources to also help us, it has a lot of service. I think it's more the service potential that I'm looking at rather than the direct economical potential. You have a lot of cultural tourism and a lot of the service potential that comes in. And when those type of activities are happening, does it always remain in its original natural state, right? When it comes to different types of things. So I think it would be helpful if we provide some explanation or definition or examples of what we mean by it's in its natural state. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Chai. Key and then Isabel. I think you are on mute, Key.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, that's much better. Much better.
The description with the 3 attributes is clear and I think fits the general understanding. And only one point I may be concerned is the usefulness of the information revealed in financial statements. Some natural resource has the ability to generate economic benefits such as mineral reserves, but in many circumstances, natural resource may be preserved for environmental and ecological protection other than economic benefits. They may satisfy the above description and can be recognized and measured, but their monetary value probably cannot reflect its service potential for public interest. So I think the suitable measurement or disclosure approach of this kind of natural resource should be chosen very carefully in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Edwin, I don't know whether you want to react before Isabel comes in.
I guess specifically to Key's point, right now we kind of touched on that in the Living Resources chapter, but we don't really set out or prescribe any measurement principles right now. We're just in the CP, it just talks broadly about factors to think about. Going back to the earlier point on water, I guess what we've landed or what the task force is proposing, and we haven't run this by the board yet, it's on Wednesday's session, but our view is when we look at water in its natural state, we're looking at water that's free flowing. And by free flowing, it's not just things that are in rivers moving around. It includes things like evaporation and seepage. So if you take it out of its natural state, it means effectively you're stopping this free flowing, which if you use the example of a dam, most of the dams don't actually stop water from moving. It just diverts it. So then that would still be in its natural state. Same with an artificial lake. There is no real way to stop evaporation, even if it is in an artificial lake, because it's still seeping into the water table and it's still evaporating. So to us, when we say taking it out of its natural state, it's really situations where you're either putting in some sort of storage tank or treatment facility or even bottling it. Like that's what we were talking about in water. And I didn't put that in the paper here because it's still to be discussed with the board on Wednesday. So.
Thanks, Edwin. I think that clarifies it much better. So probably this needs to be kind of clarified in the paper as well, because I think that really helps understanding what we mean with the natural state. Isabel and then Sami.
Thank you. I just basically want to add to what you just said, Thomas. I think there is a lot that needs to be clarified. I like the definition as it is laid out in the paper for today. However, I have the impression from our discussion now, and I think we have even touched the definition before, and I think in both situations it came out that there is a lot of a confusion or unclarity about what is in and what is out. So I think the stuff, in my opinion, the definition is good, but it seems that people need a lot of illustration to get their hands around on what is in and what is out, because it is not so obvious. So my recommendation is that you add good illustrative guidance to the standard so that you cover all potential questions that may come up from users. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. Sami and then Catherine again.
Thank you, Thomas. My comments come similar to Isabel because, okay, we come from different jurisdictions, and honestly, when I read the title of the standard, I think about our natural resources, and this is the only natural resources that I relate to. But when I read the definition, and it makes sense, but I think if we can add examples for each and every one, because for us, what's water? Is it fresh water or salty water? The water in the sea, is this natural resources? And the salt in the water, is it a natural resources? And the fish in the sea, is it natural resources or not? I think if we added some examples for each one of those categories, just not to be comprehensive, but only to let people think about what they have or what they don't, it will be very useful, because honestly, coming from different places, for me, natural resources, it's oil and gas, and that's it. There is no natural resources other than that. This is my point of view. Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Sami. I thought in your jurisdiction, water is as valuable as oil, but I can understand where you're coming from. Okay, Catherine and then Karen.
Just very briefly, so one of the things that I should have added in my initial comments was that I think, and it comes down to I think one of the points that Jeffrey made. I think that you do need to explore the boundary between the definition of agricultural assets and natural resources to make sure that the distinction is reasonably clear, because that's an obvious boundary that's going to cause issues of application. So I would just put that in there as a job to do within the development of proposals to make sure that people have some clarity around that. Timber and forestry is probably the classic example, but there may be others where that boundary might be tested.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Very helpful. Karen and then Gustavo.
Thanks, Thomas. I think the definition that's in here is a good place to start. I think in terms of how people react to it, there may need to be some developments. Personally, I find this all a bit mind-blowing in terms of kind of what is the scope and where the boundaries are. Things that are kind of, where does the intersection between mankind and human intervention and natural resource come together, and what does that mean for how we define this? I have to confess I haven't got my head around it, so I don't have any suggestions around it, but I think that might be one of the the key things that we'll need to overcome, particularly if we want to kind of have a standard that is or guidance that can be used for many years, because things that are, I think the example of a forest that is planted, you know, many of our forests would have been planted 100 years ago. You know, does that mean they're a natural resource or not? And I think some of those practical things are going to come up through the consultation and perhaps will help this going forward. But I think it is quite tricky to work out kind of where that boundary lies.
Thanks, Karen. Gustavo, and then Shanique.
Thank you. I agree with the description, but I think in the guidance it would be useful to address what happens when a new species is introduced in an ecosystem, because in the origin it had a human intervention, but then this new species integrates with others and take course natural process. So it should be important because some animal, for example, it could be introduced in a forest or in a water ecosystem, and then it becomes a resource. But only in the introduction there is a human intervention, not later.
Thanks, Gustavo. Shanique?
Yes, hi, just adding my voice that I think the definition is helpful, definitely in terms of distinguishing between what is natural resources and inventory. But I'll add my voice too that examples will be critical, and the choice of the examples will be quite the challenge in terms of making sure that it doesn't add the confusion, but adds the clarity in terms of what's natural and remains and etc. But it was, I'm sure, few words, but a massive work to come up with these few words in the definition. Thank you.
Thanks, Shanique. I think just to kind of properly clarify, we're always using the word definition. I think the board or the staff is avoiding the word definition. They're talking about description, not to provide the impression that there is a definition yet. But yes, I think probably you made a good point, Janique. It's a few words, but a lot of work. I think that is a perfect description. Anything else, colleagues? Edwin, some observatory remarks from your side regarding the last comments?
Oh, just that they're all very helpful. Thank you very much. We will add more definitions, and some of them are actually in the later chapters, so we'll give some thought into whether we should move the definitions up front to make the general description more clear. Yeah, and in the living resource chapter, for example, we do actually talk a bit about the delineation between living resources and biological assets that are under the scope of agriculture. So we will give some thought into whether that should come up front as well.
Right. Thank you, Edwin. So kind of as a summary from my side, just some high-level points. I think first of all, we kind of had some kind of problems to kind of see the delineation between the description on one side and recognition principle on the other side. I think there's kind of an interconnectivity between the two, and certainly I think that needs to be kind of be in mind when we kind of finalize the description, to kind of be aware of the importance it has for whether something goes on the balance sheet or not. That's number one. Number two, the boundary between kind of different standard scopes, I think is very, very important, like between agriculture on one side and natural resources on the other side, which kind of clarifies again the problems, and the same kind of question which has to be answered when it comes to the boundary between human intervention and not kind of impacted by human intervention, because I think this is the kind of distinctive lines between the two standards in this example. Last but not least, I think we talked about focusing more on kind of probably the service potential of what we are kind of dealing with here, rather than the economic benefits, because obviously that is more in the case of timber, for instance, in the agriculture product standard, which is covered here. I think he brought an interesting point regarding the usefulness of the information presented coming out of this project. And I think that leads over to the point Tim made regarding the holistic view on what we are talking about here versus kind of some of the assets being recognized versus assets not being recognized, and how kind of do we provide a holistic view on what kind of is the whole area of natural resources that are recognized or not, which is available in a jurisdiction. So I think that's it in a short summary regarding question 1 from my side. Anything I forgot? Okay, I see nodding or shaking heads. That's good. So with that, let's focus on the second question. Edwin, can you remind us quickly what the second question was, that we kind of respond clearly enough?
The second question was on the approach of what to do with items that are recognized and are not recognized. So for items that meet the description and meet the recognition criteria in the conceptual framework, we're proposing to recognize those items as natural resource assets in the financial statements. And for items which do not meet the recognition criteria, we're proposing that information on these items be disclosed. And we haven't really finalized it, but we're thinking of disclosures either in the notes of the financial statements or in the supplemental information in the broader general purpose financial reports.
Okay, thanks, Edwin, for reminding us regarding the question in detail. Does that mean, Edwin, did you already kind of think about how to present this information? Does that mean, for example, you would propose having a separate line item for natural resources, or any ideas regarding that?
It will most likely be a separate line item if it is a recognized asset, but in terms of the disclosures, we haven't really given that much thought yet, because that's going to be in the next chapter, which we haven't written yet in the consultation paper. So that's most likely coming in September.
Right, right. So Fabienne, just reminding that you had a comment regarding question number 2 already. Could you just kind of remind us what your point was?
Yes, actually, it was indeed with respect to attribute C and the fact that to match the definition in the conceptual framework of a resource, there is a need somehow to assess the service potential or generation of economic benefit. And I guess that's a difficult point, but comments earlier have already touched on that as well. And it's all got to do with the boundaries and how in practice I think it may be difficult to determine whether a natural resource or a natural item to assess how a natural item, to assess the service potential or the generation of economic benefits of a natural item, to assess that those attributes, so that it means that it is a natural resource, so that it meets the description for a natural resource. And an example I had, but maybe it's simplistic, but really, what about the reviews? Should they all be listed in the disclosures to the notes, or in the disclosure in the notes, or in GPFRs? That was the sort of practical questions I had reading the proposals. And again, I think as it's already been pointed out, it is really difficult to come to criteria or a description that will work in every instance. So it's a tremendous work that's being undertaken at the moment. So I fully recognize that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fabienne. I think it would be great to get your opinion if kind of something is probably fulfilling the description, but is not fulfilling the recognition criteria. As Fabienne already said, kind of on one side the extent, but on the other side the positioning of the additional information provided. Let's not call it disclosures at the moment, because with disclosures we probably immediately land just at least in our heads in the notes. But would you prefer having something in the notes, or would you kind of suggest having something in another report in order to kind of probably avoid an overload of disclosure notes to financial statements? I would be interested in getting your views on that. So first Karen and then Paul.
Thanks very much, Thomas. I mean, I agree with the approach around obviously things that meet the definition of an asset being on balance sheet, and to support transparency and accountability, that there is additional information available. To the point that you've just made, probably my preference is that it's not as part of disclosures, but sits somewhere else. But I do think there needs to be some careful consideration about what any kind of disclosures should be, wherever they sit. This could become really onerous if we're detailing every river, stream, whatever that exists, and I'm not sure that kind of information is really going to help transparency and accountability of government. So I think we need to be really clear about what are the things that are really going to assist with that, so that we don't get, we basically can't see the wood for the trees because there's just too much information that's there. So I think we need to find a way of stratifying the kinds of information there and looking at kind of what's in the top layer that's going to make a real difference from users of public financial management information.
Thanks, Karen. Paul and then Agnieszka.
Thank you, Thomas. I think like Karen, I think the first viewpoint of our respondents was the cost and practical resource constraints in doing this has been the obvious issue, especially where we have issues related to the recognition of such assets, such as uncertainties. These would presumably also apply certainty of measurement and certainty of existence to these non-assets that we would then be disclosing. Obviously, this would depend to some degree on whether disclosure is binding or optional, what sort of advice we can get on materiality for the disclosures, and obviously the scope and nature of the disclosures as well. But for me, I think the broader question is, why are we proposing this? Is it for stewardship purposes? Is it to reduce the possibility of expropriation or undervalue, issuing of contracts at an undervalue? I suppose there could be benefits for stewardship, but again, we have a lot of uncertainties on natural resources. Presumably, it'd also be quite easy to avoid reporting these on the basis of the uncertainties on existence and measurement and control and all those sorts of issues as well. And I also worry that actually disclosing such resources increases the perception that they're there to be exploited in the first place. And this is obviously an increasingly unwelcome attitude for many subsoil resources. And you can also see big issues with this for living resources and water. And there may be some jurisdictions who at the moment, their public finances are based on unrestricted uses of such assets. And perhaps this would not be beneficial globally in the long term, and may also keep attention away from other sources of potential resources, such as sunshine, for instance. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Interesting thoughts. Agnieszka and then Catherine.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. From my point of view, I would look at the problem of disclosing information on non-recognized natural resources from the point of view of financial reporting itself only. And also, I consider the issue of the potential overload of the notes as a possible risk. But also when we look look to the problem from the point of view of interlinks to the general CSR reporting, my recommendation would be to restrict the disclosure requirements to the issues that are relevant for financial reporting. And I wouldn't go into that direction to propose any kind of recommended practice guidelines for the other, because the interlinks to other reporting, climate change, CSR and everything, it would be very difficult to somehow justify. So to sum up, I would include some disclosure in the notes, not to overload, but only relevant from the point of view of financial reporting. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnieszka. Catherine, and then Sheila.
So I agree with the comments that people have made about disclosure and that both the placing and the owner's nature and what the purpose is, and being very clear on that. Just in response to the questions in the paper, I appreciate that this is from the perspective of looking at what the conceptual framework identifies as a source of uncertainty. But I have to say that the uncertainty around natural resources, to me, is not really just about it's not just about existence. It is the next stage that's probably going to be more important in terms of, have you actually then met the other definition, the other characteristics of an asset in terms of the past events, the control over it, that I think is going to be really quite difficult. So, you know, to me, these are fine to be going on with, but I think we just wouldn't underestimate the difficulty of what the next stage is going to be in terms of actually looking at whether something is should be recognised or not beyond this.
Thanks, Catherine. Sheila, Franz, and then last word, Sammy, before we go to the issue 2.
Hi, thank you, Thomas. Maybe I'm thinking too far ahead, but you know, when I consider, I get nervous when you're mentioning, you know, putting things like this on the balance sheet. You know, when somebody is considering a balance sheet or the change in the assets or liability, I think one thing I think about is accountability of elected officials. So a major, if a new natural resource is discovered, or we figure out how to measure it, then it would go on the balance sheet, perhaps, or it might even go in the notes, and then the government officials would, you know, kind of take credit that their government position increased when they really didn't have anything to do with that increase. I also agree with Paul's comment that this might, you know, by counting this or disclosing it, it might cause, you know, elected officials or government officials to exploit these assets. And then should we be thinking more of a distinction of a natural resource versus a financial resource? And we're talking about financial statements. Should a non-financial item be on a financial statement?
Thanks, Sheila. Franz, and then Sammy.
In the Netherlands, we have had natural resources, natural gas on our balance sheet from a statistical perspective for decades. And the problem has not been so much determining the existence of the natural gas, but much more the question as to how much is economically exploitable. So this interaction between future prices, and if these are higher, then our exploitable reserves are also larger. That has been the biggest problem in our experience. So I think it would be good if the consultation paper would go into this question as what is exploitable or not.
Thanks, Franz. I think that leads us already over to some extent to issue number 2 when it comes to kind of existence uncertainty, where you say, okay, existence uncertainty is not the real problem. It's more the uncertainty about what is really economically reasonably exploitable. I think that's an interesting point already to kind of park for issue number 2. Sammy, and then really last word to Tim before we move on and to issue 2.
Thank you, Thomas. I think, yes, one of the main challenges is the existence, but I think also the rights to the natural resources is very important. And again, I'm doing from our experience here, we have an issue between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt about the Nile River and who has the right for this natural resources and things like that. So I think if we can, this is something that we have to think about it, because natural resources are jointly controlled by different countries and different territories, and this will have a different way of disclosing it in each and every financial statements.
Thanks, Samir. I think definitely when it comes to recognition criteria, control and the identification who has control over natural resources is certainly a critical issue. I think that certainly has to be discussed. So Tim, and then I suggest that we move back to Edwin to lead us into issue 2.
I just very quickly, I think the point that Paul made was and others have echoed, is very important, that what we effectively disclose or what we record as assets, does impact on the decisions that are made, because they're basically standing up there, and there is, and then in terms of this, and this comes back, I think, to the point of things like weather. And if you're not valuing those assets and you're valuing sort of oil resources, then there's a decision, there's a tendency maybe to exploit those vis-a-vis these sort of greener assets that may be out there. So I think that's just an important thing to bear in mind. And, or notwithstanding the challenges of doing so, how can one present the financial statements in a way that sort of doesn't result in such a decision-making bias, let's say.
Right, thanks, Tim, for emphasizing that again. So Edwin, coming back to you for the last 20 minutes, can we go to issue 2?
Yep. Okay, so the second issue, as Ian said earlier, we have updated the CP now to talk about the recognition and measurement principles from the framework. And the reason why we did that was just to remind constituents and readers that this project is really about seeing what could be recognized based on the existing framework. It's not really trying to expand the conceptual framework right now to fit on natural resources. And to that end, we've talked about recognition and measurement. And part of recognition, the framework talks about 2 types of uncertainty, which impact the recognition of an element, and specifically assets. So the first one is existence uncertainty. And that's uncertainty over whether the definition of the element has been satisfied. So for assets, it's not really as simple as thinking, oh, does the asset really exist? It's asking the question, is there really a resource? And even if there is something that could be a resource, is that item truly capable of generating future economic benefits or have service potential? So that could relate to the earlier point of whether these are really exploitable resources. The other questions to consider in existence and uncertainty is whether the entity truly controls this resource. And the last item to consider is whether a past event has really occurred to give control of the resource to the entity. So and the second uncertainty that the framework talks about is measurement uncertainty. And that's really uncertainty over the amount of service potential or economic benefits that are embodied by the resource. So in terms of how to deal with these 2 types of uncertainties, the framework sets out a 2-step approach. So the first step is we have to consider existence uncertainty. So the questions that I've asked on the previous slide. And the difficulty here is that the conceptual framework doesn't really provide a recognition threshold per se. It just says you have to consider all the available facts and circumstances and apply judgment to conclude or to determine whether the definition has been met for the element. And then the second step, once you have determined that an element exists, i.e. once you have determined that the definition of the element has been satisfied, then you work in measurement uncertainty into the actual measurement or valuation of the element. And the way we have incorporated this into the CP, we've essentially said that for many natural resources, they cannot be readily accessible or observable in their natural state. And because of that, existence uncertainty is particularly applicable to natural resources, because there could be items that you don't know exist, or there could be items where even if you do know they exist, you don't really know if they truly are a resource that can give you economic benefits or service potential. So the question for the CAG is really, do you agree that existence uncertainty is a particular challenge that is applicable to natural resources? And if so, are there any factors that we should consider when talking about existence uncertainty in the CP?
Thanks, Edwin. Just one thing for clarification. When you talk about recognition threshold, do we mix here the perspective of something fulfilling the criteria for being a resource and fulfilling the recognition criteria? Because I know there's discussion around the recognition threshold, but that's for resources or for issues which are a resource and which are already fulfilling the recognition criteria. But because of a recognition threshold, they are not recognized, but they are already clearly fulfilling being a resource and they are fulfilling the recognition criteria. Isn't that mixing two aspects?
Sorry, so the threshold that I was talking about is the probability threshold due to the uncertainty.
Right.
Yeah, so it is different from a recognition threshold. It's really asking the question, like, are there factors which would make the existence of this resource uncertain, or make the fact that the item is a resource, like i.e. generates future economic benefits, uncertain. So it is slightly different from the general recognition threshold. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Edwin. That's kind of clarifying. So Paul, then Agnieszka.
Thank you, Thomas. I think we fundamentally agreed that it was a very difficult area, and possibly the most difficult area, but respondents also said you shouldn't under-emphasize how difficult measurement uncertainty could be for certain assets, particularly living assets, which actually may be more difficult to establish than existence. But personally, I wondered how this interacts with the interaction of sovereign powers on natural resources, which we discussed in the December CAG. Because when we were talking about subsoil resources there, it was looking at recognition only really taking place at the point that the contracts came in. Now, obviously, if that's still the approach, then that would suggest that the uncertainty issue has largely, well, not entirely resolved, because I appreciate for things like oil exploration, doing the initial oil exploration doesn't necessarily mean the asset still exists, but it would certainly seem to cut down the impact of uncertainty of existence.
Edwin, can you come in here? Because I think probably the kind of the application of sovereign power or the use of sovereign power to some extent kind of relates to the aspect of control. How do you think?
Well, I would almost step back and say the sovereign power issue and the licenses are a separate asset. So you could have recognized an asset for a license that you have purchased or that you have obtained from a government, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to find a specific amount of resources in whatever area that the license pertains to. So, to me, those are really separate assets. And it is possible for you to say, I have an asset here for the license, but once you end up actually doing the testing and all the development and so forth, you could end up with like essentially a dry hole or, something where you don't really find any resources. So to me, it's not really a linked asset. It could be very different. I don't know if that addresses Paul's question.
Yeah, Paul looks skeptic. You want to come in and Paul?
No, I fully appreciate that the license itself doesn't necessarily mean that an asset exists. So I've had clients that have had first-hand experience of this. But it was kind of how the interaction of the two could take place. But the suggestion sounds that there isn't really an interaction, and that you're perhaps going to treat them as separate assets anyway.
Right. I can see Ross raising his hand. Perhaps you want to jump in at that point, Ross, and then go over to Tim and Agnieszka.
Yeah, maybe just because I think this relates to a point that Franz made earlier about existence uncertainty. What we're talking about here really is more in the subsoil space, where you might have the licenses and everything in place for a particular area to research, development, and explore. But until you've done that research, development, exploration, you don't know how much of whatever your subsoil resource is actually there, and more importantly, economically recoverable. So when you're in the subsoil resources space, and whether it's oil and gas, but more on the mining side, I guess, even after you drill, you don't know what the metallurgy is or the geological composition of that resource. There might actually be a lot of it there, but it might not be economical to produce it at current market prices. So there's this aspect of what's under the ground, how is it composed, and can you extract it in a way that you can develop it and make money from it? And if we're talking, this is probably an issue that keeps coming up in our discussions, where people say, well, on the economic side, these things are recognized in various reports for several years. But from the economic side, and the recognition criteria aren't as strict as from a financial reporting perspective, where you have to demonstrate there is an asset, you control it, it is a resource, and then when you get to measurement, you can measure it reliably. So you need all of those aspects in place to have a financial element to recognize in the financial statements. And that's what we're trying to bottom with this existence uncertainty, is what does that mean from a financial reporting perspective? When can you recognize it? If so, how would you measure it? So the consultation paper is working through those items. We're still working through it, but there is this fundamental issue of existence uncertainty when you look at our framework and what that really means. So that's kind of maybe the gap between the sovereign powers issue and then, okay, now we might actually recognize the resources under the ground. How do you do that?
Thanks, Ross. But listening to you, I think I would answer then the question which is put to the CAG, whether the existence uncertainty is the main challenge. I would answer that by no, because it's kind of cannot be seen in isolation. Because what you kind of clearly outlined, and I think that's very helpful, is probably you can't address the other uncertainty aspects like measurement uncertainty until you started exploiting, because then you know whether it exists, you know about the quality, which leads to measurement aspects, you know about exploitability, which kind of leads to the answer of how much is not existing only, but also usable and exploitable. So I think it's all so interconnected that you probably can't say there is a main challenge and there are less important challenges. Okay, Tim, and then Agnieszka, and then moving over to Kevin.
I was just going to make the simple point is, have we been sort of learning lessons on how the private sector does this in terms of how they value and the points at which they value the sort of when they get a license and how they move that from exploration to certifying the asset to a production license. And in many ways, the licensing process is the process of what I think the mining companies call de-risking their asset in terms of turning it from a speculative thing where 80% of exploration licenses may result in nothing to actually ending up with a license that is ready to turn into a production license. And if you look at the way the profile of the value of a license over time from exploration to a production license, that increases as that asset is de-risked. So I don't know whether there's any value in learning from how the private sector does it to apply it to how and when the value is recognized as an asset on the public sector side.
Thanks, Tim. I'm definitely not a mining specialist, but I would guess that the private sector has the advantage that when it comes to measuring the licenses, they have an acquisition process, right? So they have acquisition cost as a measurement base. A government is kind of creating the licenses, which is much more difficult, I think, to value. But I agree that probably we can learn a lot from private sector and how they are dealing with things.
But as part of a license, the private sector is required to report to the government on their the work and what they have found as they do.
Yeah.
So it's not a, they have on that basis, the public sector should have that information if they are administering the licenses properly.
I agree when it comes to availability of information. I definitely agree. Yeah. Agnieszka and then Kevin.
Okay, so I'll be brief. I was disconnected for a moment, so sorry if I'm repeating something or not following in the discussion, but I also wanted to go in the line that answer an important issue, and that's probably just the way how you phrase that question. But if you ask, do you agree that the main challenge is existence uncertainty, I would say maybe not the first to deal with, but if you deal with it, the uncertainty, the measurement uncertainty is still the same, let's say, level of complexity, and also a very important issue. But judging on the way how Edwin rephrased the question we're asking, is this the challenge particular for natural resources? I realized that probably that was a little bit different focus on this question, and that probably that was the main part. But I wanted to raise that issue that measurement uncertainty is also vital in terms of this project. Thank you.
Thanks, Agnieszka. You perfectly summarized the discussion of the last minutes. Perfect. That's helpful. Kevin, then Kathleen, and then last word to Key before the break.
Thank you, Thomas. I think maybe one good example to look at would be, with the issue of rare earths, things like lithium, magnesium, nickel, those sorts of subsoils that are very important for the production of these new batteries that we're going to need. And so if we're looking for kind of a forward-looking example, and we're trying to link those concepts of existence and measurement, that might be a good case study.
Thanks, Kevin. Catherine, and then Keith.
I mean, I think to me that the link between these is between existence and measurement is volume, the volume metric. So actually you might know that something exists, but you can't assess the volume of it. And then the question of how you might monetarily value it to put it on the balance sheet is another separate measurement issue. And I think that's, to me, is where some of the uncertainty is going to lie. That you can say that it's there, that it is a resource, that it is an asset, but what you can't do is assess the boundary of it and therefore the volume. Just going back to the private sector examples, I do think that one of the things that's worth looking at, and I think it might be mentioned somewhere here, is the disclosures around proven and unproven reserves by oil companies, where there's specific SEC rules around that, which are helpful in terms of why they've done what they've done there in terms of disclosure, and there it is just disclosure. It's not on balance sheet until the extraction happens, but the importance that people place on it is considerable. If you look at what happened when there was a misstatement, I think it was by Shell, of their reserves, and the implications there were considerable for something that was effectively merely a disclosure. So I think there are issues around what the private sector does, mining, oil and gas, but I think one has to be then very careful about how you might carry that over into the wider natural resources that we're talking about, which are not necessarily the subsoil ones.
Thanks, Catherine. Key, last word, or I see Thiago coming in. Okay, last word for Thiago then.
Thanks, Chair. First, I would like to talk about uncertainty over the existence of natural resource. In my opinion, the judgment of the existence of natural resource should rely on the reliable discovering technology. If discovered, they exist, even if we think they may be there, but discovering technology cannot support the judgment of the existence of a natural resource, then we just don't recognize them for the prudence and the reliability principle. So I think there are only two options. The one is that we could recognize natural resource based on existence with discovering technology. The other one is that we could not recognize natural resource without discovering technology. And second, I would like to discuss the other challenge of recognition of natural resource in practice. In practice, the information needed to, for recognition and the measurement of natural resource will rely on the administrative departments. The administrative departments may not be able to provide all the information which accounting system needs, because their working purpose is different from accounting system. For example, some administrative departments of preserve the forest category, the trees in forest only into bushes and formed trees. The category information can meet their needs, but brings difficulties to our recognition and measurement. That's all.
Thanks, Kim. So I'm not sure, Tiago, do you want to come in or?
Yes, just one issue considering groundwater, not talking about forest now, but starting with groundwater. It's a main resource, and there are several issues being discussed through several municipalities here in Portugal. One main issue is about the exploration of water, because if there is over exploration, it reduces the amount of water that may be stored in a natural way. Something else is the elimination of forest that sustains the recuperation of the amount of water in subsoil. So when we talk about how to evaluate groundwater, we have some other issues considering public administration, public sector, and issues of governance of this asset. There are some similarity with forests also, but groundwater is a main issue now. Is it going to be addressed, groundwater, because it's a major problem? What kind of value should it be? Because it's in some municipalities, it's really a strategic reserve. Ensure that there will be water to drink during the next decades or hundreds of years. So will this be addressed? Is this being considered?
Thanks, Tiago. I think you're asking an important question, and that leads back to the remark which was made by Paul as well. Why are we requesting this information? What's the objective?
Yes.
Is it stewardship, or is it governance, or is it another objective? I think we should kind of push that back to staff. I think it should be clear in the objective or the description of the objective of the project, what's the purpose of the information being provided. And then this answers also the question where to provide this information for a most suitable way. Thanks, Tiago, for bringing this up. So with that, I think we can kind of close the topic agenda item 3. I think we had a very good discussion, and it was very valuable input, I'm sure, for the board as well. I would now suggest that we break for 10 minutes, starting again a quarter to the full hour, so 45. If you could come back 45 for the next agenda topic, or the last agenda topic actually, which is agenda topic 4, revenue and transfer expenses. Thank you.
Thank you.
Time for a break. Right.
This is your 1 minute warning, 1 minute remaining in the break. We are at 7:45 if everybody can return to their seats, or at 1/4 to the hour.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. Welcome back, everybody. We are continuing our meeting now with the agenda item number 4, which is revenue and transfer expenses. And as you have seen from the paper, we have 2 areas to be covered in this discussion. One is a short, I would call it more a report back. There's not a lot to discuss and a lot to kind of be requested from us as the CAG when it comes to kind of how the CAG member advice was recognized in the revenue project discussion. And the second topic then, this is where we have the main focus of our discussion in this agenda item is the comments from constituents regarding the transfer expenses part of the project ED 72. So Eileen has prepared the paper, and can I ask Eileen to introduce us to the first agenda item 4.1 and lead us through the aspects how the CAG advice was considered in the revenue project, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So just give me 1 second while I share the screen.
Even 2?
Hopefully less if technology is kind to me.
Okay.
Okay, great. So thank you again, Thomas, for the introduction to the agenda item. And thanks again to CAG members for your time and your input today on the revenue and transfer expense projects. So as you may recall, the IPSASB received a significant number of responses to ED 70, 71, and 72. And the board has made good progress since our initial discussions in December 2020. Now, before jumping into the first item, we wanted to first show you this updated timeline, which was first presented in December, that illustrates where we currently are in the assessment of the responses to the ED. So CAG member input has been incredibly valuable and incorporated into IPSASB deliberations over the last 3 sessions. So specifically in December and March, the IPSASB considered CAG member advice in discussing responses to the revenue EDs, focusing on principle-related issues. And these key decisions that came out of those sessions also guided the board in April, where the board discussed principle-related issues, specifically with transfer expense, the ED that was also issued at the same time. During that time, the board also considered those decisions in revenue and whether they had implications on transfer expense. So as Thomas said, we'll be going through 2 items today. One is going to be a quick report back on revenue, and the other will be a focus on transfer expenses. And the advice that you'll provide today, as well as what you've provided previously, will definitely help the board move forward as it addresses issues this June, as well as in September and onward. I'll take a pause here if there are any questions about the timeline before proceeding. So let me just take down the screen.
So colleagues, any questions regarding the timeline as presented by Eileen? Okay, that doesn't seem to be the case. So with that, we can continue, Eileen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the first item we'll be talking about today is revenue. In December, staff presented 2 specific issues to CAG members and received useful advice on both issues, as well as some general considerations. We've provided a quick summary on this slide here. The first issue that was discussed was about presenting guidance, and specifically the flow and the structure of the revenue standards from a public sector perspective. Generally, CAG members favored option 1, which was to continue with 2 separate standards, reordered to start with ED 71 principles, as it better reflected the prevalence of public sector revenue transactions. A number of CAG members also favored option 2, which essentially was 1 revenue standard, and that was considered to potentially improve the usability and the understandability of accounting guidance for revenue. We also presented option 3, which was to leave the standards as is, so 70 followed by 71, and that did receive some support, but not as strongly as the other 2 options. Issue number 2, which was discussed in December, was about the appropriate level of disclosures, and CAG members generally supported staff's proposal to further consider disclosure requirements based on the nature of transactions and to maintain a principle-based approach. This meant aligning ED 70 disclosures with IFRS 15 and revising ED 71 and 72 disclosures to be more practical and applicable for the public sector. Some other advice that was more general to the projects as a whole was to ensure that we continue to reflect the prevalence of public sector transactions in addressing constituent concerns, ensuring that we can reflect the difference in the nature and risks associated with different types of revenue transactions, ensuring consistency in accounting principles across the suite of standards, and overall considering the adjustments and repetition of guidance to ensure that the standards can actually stand alone, which would improve usability and potentially include introductory guidance to help users understand the delineation and application of the standards. Now on the slide here, I'm going to present a quick summary, and the paper provides more detail, but essentially there have been quite a few topics discussed by the IPSASB over the 3 sessions, 4 of which we're going to highlight on this slide here. The first is regarding just a general consideration of guidance in the context of IPSAS users. The IPSASB had some good discussions and confirmed that the majority of public sector revenues are more likely non-exchange type transactions, and thus the titles of the proposed standards should be revised and additional guidance should be considered to be included to help users as previously mentioned. The second topic that really benefited from CAG member advice, which is summarized here on this slide, is regarding how to present revenue guidance. Now, based on the CAG member feedback on options 1 and 2, the board decided to reorder revenue guidance using option 1 for now, and that they will be duplicating guidance where necessary to ensure that the IPSAS are freestanding. The third revenue topic we wanted to highlight is regarding binding arrangements and some of the components that feed into binding arrangements. The IPSASB reconfirmed that enforceability is very important for binding arrangements, and they can arise from various mechanisms. These mechanisms will vary by jurisdiction and arrangement, so an entity would need to assess all relevant factors in doing this assessment of their binding arrangement and the transactions overall. The last revenue topic we wanted to highlight, where the IPSASB benefited directly from CAG member input, is about distinguishing revenue arising from performance obligations. The IPSASB's discussion noted that they wanted to retain revenue with performance obligations as a separate type of revenue, and it is considered to be a subset of present obligations and represent a minority of public sector revenue. So overall, the IPSASB made good progress in discussing principle-related issues noted by respondents to the revenue EDs and addressing constituent comments, and they will continue to consider advice from CAG members as they proceed with addressing issues in both projects in the coming sessions. So at this time, the question that staff would have is that we're interested to hear whether CAG members have any further thoughts on how this advice has been incorporated to date and how advice should be further considered in the revenue project as it progresses. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. So, colleagues, this is a little bit like speak up now or be silent forever. This is your opportunity now to kind of make any additional comments, either regarding what has been mentioned by Eileen or something additional which has not been mentioned. So, Catherine and then Fabienne.
So thank you very much for that, Eileen. It's very clear. And I think, I agree with you, good progress. Really, I think my main points, apart from being supportive, is just to say that it's going to be clarity of the standards and ease of use that are going to make the big difference to people. So I think a lot therefore rests on the final drafting and the way that the standards are in the end structured, and whether they are genuinely standalone, for example. And I do think that because these are so critical as standards within the whole IPSASB suite, thinking about whether there's any stress testing that can be done around that in terms of getting people to look at the standards who perhaps are not so familiar with them to see if they find them usable and workable. I think this, to me, is going to be the key issue. So clarity and ease of use, I think, so people don't get lost about where they should be within the standards when they're dealing with any particular type of revenue stream is going to be the critical factor, however they're structured in the end.
Thanks, Catherine. Can you provide us with an idea of how a stress test could look like?
Well, if you've got somebody who perhaps had responded throughout the project, to ask them if they've got somebody who's maybe more on the operating financial side of things, but who might have to apply these, who's perhaps not been so heavily involved in the responses to them, and ask them to do a cold look at them and said, if you had to apply these standards today, how straightforward would you find it in the context of what we do, just to get some feedback on that. And you could maybe get a few people to try to do that. I just think that these are ones that are going to fall down only if people just come back to us later and say, we can't work out how to actually apply them in practice. So that practicality is going to be very important.
So in easy words, to answer the question, would you know what to do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay, thank you. Fabienne and then Thiago.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering, I'm not sure whether that comment is going to be helpful. Beyond the fact that the assertion in one of the paragraphs in the paper that revenue arising from performance obligation likely represents a minority of public sector revenues, I was also wondering whether the emphasis shouldn't be placed on operate transactions, maybe not really transactions that arise from binding arrangements, from those that do not arise from binding arrangements, rather than a difference, a drawing line between with or without performance obligations. So, taxes on some transfers are really, in my mind, not arising from binding transactions because it's a one-way thing. And the rest that is arising from binding arrangements is either with or without performance obligation. So I was wondering whether that could be useful to have that broad picture to figure that out. Just hopefully that might help. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabienne. All comments are helpful. Thank you for that. Fabienne, no, Eileen, do you want to react on what Fabienne just said?
Yeah, happy to share some thoughts, and thank you for your feedback, Fabienne. They're always very helpful. In terms of the delineation, I guess I would bring it back to some of the board discussions on how we even came up with the split to begin with. And part of the decision of where to draw the line, if you will, was that ED 70 was intended to be aligned with IFRS 15, and that would essentially reflect those exchange type transactions. So we do recognize there's a few points where you could split it, but that difference between those with performance obligations and without performance obligations was best reflective of that alignment with IFRS and making sure that we are better covering the public sector difference there.
Thank you, Eileen. Tiago, and then Key, or Ian, do you want to jump in immediately at that point? Could be the right point in time.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. I mean, I think absolutely agree with what Eileen said, but I think, you know, in reordering, in deciding to reorder the standards, I think the board was very conscious of the point that Fabienne made. You know, because we actually, and it was very useful, actually staff did an analysis across different types of organisation at different levels to say broadly where would the types of income fall within the standards. And I think that made the point quite clearly that you needed, if you like, the entry point needed to be through the kind of flowchart process that you have in ED 71. Now, that I think picks up on the point that Catherine made very well, which is actually the key to this is going to be the clarity of navigating people through the guidance. And, you know, that's where I think when we go back into that, you will see that essentially there are a lot of types of revenue which don't have a binding arrangement in them and therefore will not come lower down the flow charts. You know, those will lead to immediate recognition when you've got control and so on. So I think that clarity is going to be really important. I think, you know, the other thing that perhaps I would draw out is that the board hasn't yet made a decision finally, although it's leaning towards keeping the two standards for the reason that Eileen articulated. There are certainly, you know, voices around the board table saying at the moment, actually, do we need two standards? So that is still not yet decided. And I think we as a board will need to have a further look into the differences between presence and performance obligations, because as Eileen has articulated, that's very relevant, for example, in terms of levels of disclosure and so on. I would just also pick up the point that Catherine made. I think you know, doing some road testing when we get further towards the final guidance is going to be very helpful. And certainly I've already sort of sounded one or two people out amongst our major users to say, would you be prepared to be on a sort of reference group or something like that, just to you know, try the near final guidance out, because I think that will be very useful because it will be important. Thanks, Thomas.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That was really helpful. Tiago, and then Key.
I just like to say that I've been struggling, like Fabienne, with the same issues, but I think that this change that was determined or implemented really helps us to build up. It's quite important for me, the emphasis in ED 72. And I think that one very pragmatical approach will be, and that's something that we are working on, identifying all the situation or the main situation with higher values, predefining them. I always have two issues in implementing new rules. One is ensure that our politicians accept them because we must put them in a decree law. And the second one is implementation, when it's me that deliver accounting system for central government. And I think that with these changes in these days, we have a working space to identify the major situations. And I think that's a very pragmatical way, kind of working scenarios that will be predefined for most of the situations that we have. It will take a lot of work. We'll make a table with the situations, with the accounting procedures, but I think it's feasible. With this kind of wording, and with this kind of emphasis, I think it's feasible. We are working on that now. So I was quite pleased with these changes because now I have a work feasible with the politicians and with the accountants and the implementation of software. So thank you.
Thanks, Thiago. Very encouraging. Key?
Thanks, Thomas. I have one suggestion about two kinds of obligations in ED. The two key concepts, present obligation and performance obligation, may be presented in a better way to show the relationship and the difference between two concepts. A performance obligation is a specific subset of present obligation. For example, all performance obligations are present obligation, but not all present obligation are performance obligation. But in ED 71, a present obligation is defined as a duty to act or perform in a particular way and may give rise to a liability in respect of any transaction without a performance obligation, which may be interpreted into that present obligation excludes a performance obligation and lead to confusion. My suggestion is that the present obligation includes performance obligations and non-performance obligations. Using non-performance obligation instead of present obligation without performance obligation may give a clear hierarchy of the two concepts. That's all. Thank you.
Eileen, immediate reaction to that?
Yeah, thank you, Key. I think any suggestions on how we can help clarify the delay issue would be helpful. I guess my initial reaction is the use of the term present obligations is consistent with what we have in the conceptual framework at this time. So it would be something we would need to think about a bit further about the actual terminology that we use. But the description itself can definitely be revisited to make sure we are crystal clear that it is the kind of larger bucket, if you will, and performance obligations are a subset within that. So there isn't any confusion about what is excluded or included. But thank you for the point, and we'll consider that further.
Thanks, Eileen. But I think the main important thing is that we can confirm the understanding of Key that present obligation contains performance obligations, but not the other way around. So I think the understanding is correct. Yep. So that's already helpful. All right, I don't see any further issues. So in summary, I think we can kind of highlight that kind of clarity and ease of use is kind of really important. And I think the idea of stress testing is really a good idea, and bringing or connecting that with the idea of Thiago regarding kind of the table of the main important transactions with high values in the different areas of transaction classes could help as well when doing this stress test. So I think some good additional comments to what we already had, Eileen, and with that I think we can move over to agenda item 4.2 if there are no further comments.
Thanks, Thomas. I'm just going to share my screen again. So this is the second agenda item that we're presenting today, and we'll be pivoting now to talk about the transfer expense project. The transfer expense project seeks to develop a new standard for transfer expenses that is consistent with the accounting for equivalent revenue transactions. So overall, the IPSASB received 65 comment letters in response to ED 72. And to help facilitate today's discussion, we wanted to provide a bit of a longer presentation, which we hope members will find helpful to further the discussion about the issue itself. So based on a review, we did receive overall support for the proposed guidance. A majority of respondents did generally agree or partially agree with the specific matters for comment that were presented. However, based on the review, some respondents also did identify potential conceptual flaws that require further analysis. Now, considering all the issues together, we noted that some relate to principles and others did not relate to principles. So for example, comments on complexity or practicality of the standard or requests for additional or revised guidance. And in April 2021, the board had decided to address principle-related issues first. Some respondents also highlighted potential conceptual issues on specific components of the proposed accounting model. And as such, the underlying principles for transfer expense accounting will need to be further considered and revised accordingly. Now, one of the key issues identified that poses potential inconsistencies in principles is on the distinction between transfer expenses with and transfer expenses without performance obligations. This distinction is an important part of ED 72. And in the next slides, I'm going to present first at a high level what the proposed guidance was in ED 72 to help illustrate why this distinction is so integral to the proposed accounting. Then we'll go into what constituents have said about the issue and what the implications are of those comments. And then we'll finish up with seeking CAG member advice that will assist the IPSASB in addressing the issue raised. So at a high level, at inception, the transfer provider must first complete a detailed analysis to determine if they have entered a binding arrangement with the transfer recipient. These binding arrangements may or may not include other parties, but for simplification today, we're going to assume just another transfer recipient. Now, in this case, does the transfer recipient also have a performance obligation? The results of this analysis would dictate which accounting model the transfer provider would apply. So for example, if the transfer recipient does have a performance obligation, then the transfer provider would apply the public sector performance obligation approach, or PSPOA, and the transfer provider would then recognize the transfer expense with performance obligation when or as the transfer recipient satisfies a performance obligation. However, if based on the analysis, the transfer recipient does not have a performance obligation, then the transfer provider would apply the other accounting model to account for the transfer expense. In this case, the transfer provider would recognize the transfer expense without performance obligation at the earlier of when the provider has provided the resources or when the transfer provider has transferred the resources. Now, stepping back, this means that a significant emphasis is placed on the transfer provider's correct analysis and identification of whether the counterparty in the transfer expense transaction, i.e. the transfer recipient, has a performance obligation arising from the binding arrangement. Now, the IPSASB specifically requested feedback from constituents on this distinction, and a little over half agreed, generally on the basis of consistency with the distinction provided in revenue. However, 25% disagreed for several different reasons. The first is that these respondents considered there to be no economic difference on the transfer provider and thus would not actually be relevant. Instead, these respondents have noted that accounting guidance should assist the transfer provider in determining whether they still have an unsatisfied obligation, or in cases where they have begun satisfying their own obligation, whether they still retain control of an asset. The second major reason was that this was not fully reflective of the public sector transactions. So the current distinction proposed, which would lead to separate accounting requirements for transfer expenses, may not faithfully represent the substance of underlying transactions for the transfer provider and reflect the economic reality of transfer expenses in the public sector, where a majority of the transactions are without performance obligations. So for example, the immediate recognition of transfer expenses in cases where the transfer provider has transferred resources but still retains control would not be considered appropriately reflecting the transaction itself. A third reason that these respondents noted is inconsistency in principles. Respondents that didn't agree generally acknowledged that mirroring the distinction that was in revenue is sensible, but it didn't necessarily achieve a consistency in accounting principles. And they emphasized that this potentially artificial and yet very precise distinction becomes critical in the appropriate application of accounting guidance. And thus, this may lead to an inconsistent principles being applied. The last major reason we wanted to highlight was difficulty in practice. The distinction was considered complex by the constituents that didn't quite agree with the distinction, and they noted that it might be difficult to achieve in practice because of the administrative burden and potential overcomplication of the accounting. And they felt that this complication didn't necessarily provide useful and relevant information. In other words, the costs may not fully justify the benefits. Now, considering this feedback as a whole, what did it mean overall? Well, as noted earlier, the transfer provider's correct analysis and identification of the transfer recipient's stated obligations is integral to the correct application of the proposed accounting guidance, because the distinction determines the recognition and measurement of the transaction itself. This means there really is a big trickle impact, and concerns about the distinction between transfer expenses with and without performance obligations overlapped with concerns about other proposals in the ED. And we wanted to emphasize a few of these. For example, the concern about the distinction also meant that these constituents had concerns about the difficulty monitoring the satisfaction of the transfer recipient's performance obligations. And this may be due to a wide range of reasons, for example, lack of data, not being able to practically monitor the performance, and also may lead to selective accounting decisions by the entity to achieve desired outcomes. A second is regarding the different accounting under transfer expenses without performance obligations. As an example, constituents that disagreed with the proposal to distinguish the two types of transfer expenses as proposed in 8072 would generally note that on one side, you would defer recognition of an expense where the transfer recipient has a performance obligation, but you would recognize an expense immediately when the transfer recipient does not have a performance obligation, irrespective of whether the transfer recipient has a present obligation from the binding arrangement. The last trickle impact that we wanted to highlight was just about the concerns on the distinction that reasonably overlap with concerns on practical difficulties with applying the PSPOA model. Now, considering these comments holistically, staff note that these concerns can really trace back to one specific element, and that is that the guidance proposed in 8072 required the transfer provider, i.e. the entity actually applying the proposed transfer expense standard, to consider the transaction from the transfer recipient's perspective rather than from the entity's own perspective. So based on the comments and our analysis, staff propose changing the perspective overall and to consider and evaluate the transaction and obligation from the transfer provider perspective. We believe changing this perspective will assist the IPSASB to first determine whether retaining this distinction is useful for the transfer provider, and also for the IPSASB to then consider the implications on the recognition and measurement principles in the proposed accounting guidance to therefore address the constituent comments. Changing the transfer provider perspective will also help with confirming what is the transfer provider's right in the binding arrangement, what is its obligation, how the accounting principles on recognition and measurement should reflect these rights and obligations, whether or not and when the transfer provider retains control of an asset, and whether the continued use of two different accounting treatments as proposed is still justified. Then stepping back, making sure that the proposed accounting principles in transfer expenses are as a whole consistent with the principles for revenue where it is appropriate. So the questions for the CAG members today are, in your view, whether based on the summary provided today and in the papers, does the proposed response to consider the transfer provider perspective address these concerns? If not, please let us know why and what other factors you believe the IPSASB should consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen, for that great presentation. I think that really very clearly presented what the issues are. I think that's a great basis for the discussion. I'm sure a lot want to come in, a lot of members want to come in on that. So I think my questions probably are, if kind of we go a little bit more in detail of what we want to discuss. First of all, do you think that the presentation kind of correctly summarized the concerns and the problems which were arising? And secondly, whether the root cause analysis, which Eileen presented, is leading to the kind of correct results regarding what is kind of causing the concerns. And thirdly, then the suggested approach is leading in the right direction. So addressing the concerns and by that kind of leading to kind of a true and fair view kind of the transactions which were described by Eileen. So with that, opening up the discussion, actually, I would have expected already having 10 hands raised up at that point in time, but that I think you're all overwhelmed from the great presentation of Eileen, but please, can I encourage you to come in? I think that's extremely important now. So Thiago, please start us off.
Just started where I stopped. As I told you before, Eileen, I think this approach really helps us in implementation. For me, implementation is always the most important thing. As you know, I am a high official of the Ministry of Finance. I'm always extremely concerned with the feasibility of new rules, the implementations considering accounting systems, but the process themselves. And it's very important for us to identify that people know how to do. And more than that, that the accounting statements, we know that always going to national accounts. As an official of Ministry of Finance, I must always think of that. So when we implement something like this, we must ensure that the correct accounting is made and it's correctly addressed into national accounts. I know that national accounts are statistics, but we can never, ever forget that when we implement something like this. I think this is feasible, though it will take a lot of work identifying all the main situations, those who have most high money impact. So it's feasible. I think we'll really address quality, we'll have better information, and I think that considering these new writings, it is feasible. It will take a lot of work, but it's feasible and we'll have better quality. So let's go. We have started already identifying the situations. It will take some time. We'll have a lot of situations in Portugal that are defined by law. So we want to ensure that everyone will do the correct accounting statements. So we'll create scenarios of accounting in our central accounting systems. So people will have to choose which kind of scenario they will have to use. Kind of that. Very pragmatical approach. It's possible, a lot of work, but it's feasible. Well, that's my point of view.
Thank you, Thiago. Just a follow-up question. Can I understand you like changing the perspective from the transfer recipient to the transfer provider is increasing feasibility and practicability and is addressing the concerns which were raised in terms of how can the transfer provider know whether the transfer recipient has fulfilled all performance obligations?
Yes, because I control the process. It's not me myself, but the central structure that determines the transfer, the transfer will have that kind of ability to confirm when the transfer is done, what kind of destination it will be used. So for me, it's easier because I have a very centralized process in Portugal with these transfers. So I will be able to control if I have identified which kind of transfers will be used. So for me, it's easier. So for me, it's kind of click, you know, this is the change that makes it available. I was quite upset with this change because I wasn't understanding how could we implement this with quality, because each case would be a case. That's impossible. There are thousands of transfers. And with this kind of perspective, for me, I think we have as I told you, a way to work out.
Yeah, thank you, Thiago. That's helpful. Okay, we are reaching now the 10 nearly. So with that, Paul, then Franz.
Thank you, Thomas. In respect of Thomas's sort of hierarchy of questions, yes, I certainly in respect of our response, I think the analysis does correctly present stakeholder concerns. Obviously, we haven't had a chance to go through every single response. In respect of whether the guidance on using the recipient's perspective solves all this, I'm not entirely sure, because we had issues in respect of the limited nature of the public sector performance obligation approach in contexts such as highlighted by Rosa in her presentation to the December 19 CAG, where you have a present obligation for a transfer provider, but the transfer recipient doesn't necessarily have a performance obligation to third parties for goods and services. And we were actually thinking that the 5-step approach could be extended to more present obligations rather than just performance obligations. And I don't think that would be possible just by changing the viewpoint because of the specific wording in paras 10 and 90, which actually sort of delineate whether there's a transfer obligation, supply of goods or services to a third party by the transfer recipient. So I might be a bit literal in how I've interpreted your solution, but I also think the wording of paras 10 and 90 would need to be changed for certain contexts. But then I also wonder whether actually looking at it from the transfer provider's point of view kind of makes the public sector performance obligation approach such a small subsector then of transfer of public sector expenses that actually having it as a separate distinction, as a separate category, makes any sense anymore, and whether we shouldn't be looking at a broader approach for present obligations where the transfer provider can demonstrate that they still have some control over the resource being transferred over, say, a period of time, rather than continually reduce the number of transactions that the public sector performance obligation approach could apply to for transfer expenses. I'm not sure if that made sense or not, but I'll be happy to expand on it.
Thanks, Paul. I'm sure it makes sense. Not so sure whether everybody understood it already. Eileen, any immediate reactions, especially regarding the extension of the application of the 5-step approach as outlined by Paul?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, and thank you, Paul. Definitely good points. And I think what I would like to clarify, because I guess I didn't present it very well in the preceding slides, is that the change in the perspective is really just a starting point. It's not going to be the solution to all of the issues noted within the ED, but we think it's a good place to start, especially because as we're addressing the issues, we're trying to start from kind of the inception of a transaction and move forward through the overall lifeline, if you will, of a transaction itself. And so looking at it from the transfer provider perspective, at least at the beginning, will help us make sure we are actually properly determining what the obligation is and what the right is for the transfer provider. And from there, then we'll move into thinking about what the accounting principles previously proposed on recognition and measurement, what needs to change and what maybe can stay. I think if, depending on where we go with the models themselves, whether we continue with the 2 separate accounting models, or maybe we perhaps go towards one, I don't think the principles disappear, but it's more just using that lens to critically assess whether those accounting principles we have previously identified actually do need to change to properly reflect the nature of the transactions. One of which, as you noted, is whether or not the transfer provider still retains control of the resources that they have transferred at a point in time within the transaction. So all in all, I would say it's an early step. We're hoping it's a good guiding vision, if you will, to assess all of the issues, but it's not a silver bullet to fix all the problems. It's going to take, the analysis issue by issue to make sure we really land in a good place where the standards are going to actually be helpful and effective and practical to reflect the accounting for the transactions that the public sector faces.
Thanks for this additional clarification, Eileen, and don't worry, your presentation has been very clear, don't worry. Franz and then Isabel. Franz disappeared.
I tend to be very supportive of the staff's proposal to look at it from the transfer provider's perspective. It comes natural because that's the reporting entity. But my question would be, did staff also give it a thought as to what would happen if the transfer provider and the transfer recipient would account for the same transaction in different ways? And what would then happen if both of them would be the same, belonging to the same economic entity? And what would happen to the consolidated financial statements? Of course, in statistics, you look much more at mirroring, but in the public sector, it happens ever so often that the recipient and the transfer provider end up in the same set of consolidated financial statements.
Thanks, Franz, for that. Eileen, do you want to respond immediately? I think we had similar discussions in other projects. I just remember in the leasing project, we had the same discussion. What if kind of the lessor and lessee are accounting differently, how to kind of do elimination in the consolidated financial statements. I think we heard some very interesting practical solutions to that from the UK at that point in time. Eileen, anything to respond here?
Yeah, thank you, Franz, and thank you, Thomas. I guess my initial reaction is, especially because there are a lot of entities that fall into the same consolidated statements and overall hierarchy, what we're trying to do is really think about the accounting from that principal perspective. And I think what has helped to make sure that we don't end up with wildly different accounting is that the present obligations and the performance obligations that we continue to talk about for the transfer recipient and transfer provider are all coming from binding arrangements. And these binding arrangements will always ensure there's a level of enforceability of the rights and obligations that are within the arrangement. And that generally will help us to make sure that there is some consistency in how a transfer of resources is being recognized on the transfer provider side versus on the transfer recipient side. The good thing is we are doing both projects together at the same time in parallel, and the board is continuing to stay conscious of the fact that we are trying to be consistent in accounting principles and taking it back to what the nature is of these transactions. So hopefully where we land, we'll still provide that clarity, but it is something that the board is continuing to address. I hope that helps.
It truly does. Thanks, Eileen. Isabel, and then Tim.
Yeah, thank you. I think the comment that Eileen made before her last comment was a little bit going in a way that I was considering that the definition is maybe okay, but my initial reaction on the wording was that it would not be enough if the transfer provider looks at the transaction from the transfer recipient's perspective. Because if the transfer recipient has a performance obligation to perform, then there needs to be an assessment whether the obligation is fulfilled, yes or no. And I think that the transfer provider has to have an issue in this assessment and cannot just leave this to the perspective of the transfer recipient, because there may be different opinions on whether the obligation is fulfilled, yes or no. So I think it would, the current wording leaves this a little bit open to me. And from my experience from the local perspective, it is very important that there is a very firm assessment on whether an obligation is fulfilled.
Thanks, Isabel. I think you perfectly describing the concern which has been connected to kind of focusing on the transfer recipient perspective. So the suggested approach is now to switch the perspective and to look more from the transfer provider's perspective, exactly for the reasons which you described. Eileen, do you want to kind of just confirm that?
Yeah, nothing specific to add, Thomas. I would agree with the statement you just made. I think maybe moving to the transfer provider perspective will just be helpful as well for the reasons we've also noted in the session itself. In terms of wording, this is definitely something we've got on our docket to make sure that we get the wording right, to make sure we're clearly communicating what the user needs to consider in doing the assessment and the accounting itself.
Right, thanks, Eileen. With that, over to Tim, please.
So this is complicated. And I mean, I think it's crucial that it's looked at both from the provider and recipient perspective. But I don't think that necessarily will get us over some of the problems I think that were observed in the comments. And I think the key thing is this information and this around a binding agreement. So, I mean, at the World Bank, we deal with with developing and middle income countries. And I think in a lot of transfers, there's an aspiration for there being a binding agreement with a transfer. But enforceability is the issue, and I think in making this decision, they will and I think putting my mind in a Ministry of Finance, they will decide a lot of things have a binding, have a performance obligation, but then when it comes to actual implementation, it is not enforceable and they do not get the information back. And so although in certain, I think, cases, taking this, having a standard which involves the enforcement is important, but is there a way of having a differentiated approach as well, of leaving the the country to be able to basically sort of make a choice of what accounting principle they do based on the capacity of that institution. And I think, taking a step back, we in a lot of countries we see sort of partial adoption of IPSASB because lots of these things are kind of unfeasible from the country perspective, and therefore there's selective adoption of some of these standards. And I just, because of the complexity and the information challenge and the challenge of enforcing binding agreements, I see a lot of challenge in implementing this in a developing country context.
Thanks, Tim. Can I just make sure that I understand you correctly? Perhaps Eileen has understood it perfectly already, but so you're saying binding arrangement is an important kind of aspect for kind of the distinction between the different accounting treatments, but enforceability of these binding arrangements is the real problem, especially in kind of developing countries. Is that what you want to say? And that there needs to be kind of like different accounting approaches being based on enforceability, yes or no? Is that what you want to say?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I think there will be an aspiration for something that is enforceable, but then you get to a sticking point where you've gone down the route of, we're going to use this accounting principle, but then you can't do it in practice. And right. So I think that's part of the problem. And so is there a way of actually allowing for a differentiated approach of saying that even though we made a decision that we have a binding agreement, can we decide to just expense it at the outset, rather than waiting, let's say, in an intergovernmental fiscal transfer, all local governments to have reported on their performance of obligations, and that to be verified, which in a lot of cases won't be.
Right. Thanks, Tim. I always get nervous if I see the technical director raising his hand, so I would allow Ross to come in because I think it might be urgent.
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Maybe just to highlight what's already proposed and where we're going with a little more nuance. So the discussion we'll be having with the IPSASB this week will be about this notion of enforceability and what that means. And what we mean is, if you have a binding arrangement, in substance, it has to be enforceable. So Tim, maybe to your point, how you're describing it, they might be drafting these arrangements with the feeling that they're enforceable, but in effect, they're not enforceable. So in those cases, you would already be in the portion of the standard that deals with accounting for arrangements where there is no binding arrangement, and the accounting treatment is exactly how you've explained it. So that's already in the standard. I'm not sure the board will probably get as far as you might be suggesting, where there's actually an accounting policy choice that the entity could make. I think from a principled perspective, if there's a binding arrangement and it is enforceable, then the accounting that we're setting out for that, those types of transactions should be accounted for in that principled way. But if the situation is, as you suggest, where they might be aspirational, but they don't actually have binding arrangements, then you'd be in the non-binding arrangement accounting guidance that we have in the standard, which would be immediate recognition from the transfer provider perspective. But I don't think that'll be an explicit choice entities will be able to make. They'll have to look at the substance of their arrangements, whether they are in fact enforceable. And that'll be a discussion that they'll have to have with their auditors and come to agreement on where in the standard they'd be. And I think that's, again, the board might move on that a little bit, but I don't think we'll be in a accounting policy choice perspective. Thanks.
Thanks, Ross. with that, leading over to to Rosa, and I'm impatiently waiting for her reaction. If you just could kind of address the three aspects which I was asking for. One, has the concerns been correctly addressed and identified? The second, the root cause, is that correct? And thirdly, is staff proposing the right approach to address the concerns? Rosa.
Thank you, Thomas. Hello, everybody. And I would like to start thanking Eileen for the presentation, because really was very clear, concise, and that it's always very helpful. I would like to say that I agree with the proposed focus on the transfer providers. As has been said by others, it's a good start. It will facilitate implementation, and I think it will allow to address some conceptual issues that we have now. And I am also very happy to see that the question of the assets is also included. And you know very well that this aspect of the assets for us and for the European Commission, it's very clear and very important. Another point that I would like to recognize is that I appreciate that the benefit of conceptual consistency between the revenue standards and the standards on transfer expenses is acknowledged and very well reflected very well the board discussions during the last months. I would like also to note, I think it's a little bit in line what Paul said before, that focusing on the transfer provider's perspective might show that the current distinction between performance obligations and present obligations is not needed for the expense side, and maybe other criteria might play a more dominant role. And for example, assets could be one of these other criteria. And to finalize, I would like to say that it will be very important to analyze this proposed approach with a very open and free mind, because it could be something that could be very good for the development of this standard. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, Rosa. I think in summary, I think that sounds supportive regarding how staff addressed and the board is addressing the issue. Thanks, Rosa, for that. Very encouraging. Karen and then Inge.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm supportive of looking at this from the transfer provider's perspective, because that's the entity that's recording it. So I think that's the right place to start. I was pleased to hear what Eileen said earlier about that not being a silver bullet, though, because I think there are lots of things to think about around kind of accountability and transparency, and making sure that actually that where there is a performance obligation, that the entity providing the grant actually is getting full value from the funds that it has provided. And I think that's an important part of financial reporting that we shouldn't lose. I just wanted to pick up as well on the consolidation points as well. As someone who has prepared whole of government accounts, I understand only too well the stresses and difficulties of dealing with eliminations. But I think there's a trade-off here about, if you like, between government entities, how much of that is done in the entity and how much of that is done at the centre. And I think we need to kind of look at how much work individual entities would need to do if they were practicing mirroring, versus how much could be done at the centre in terms of use of materiality. So whilst conceptual consistency, I think, is a good thing to have, I think it's important that in terms of mirroring, we don't hold that to be a gold standard to try and aim for, when actually there are other trade-offs to make along the way. I think, we just need to be a bit careful about that. And as I said, I think it's just really important that from an individual entity perspective, that where they're providing grants, that the entity is sure that it's getting value from it. So however the accounting's done, there need to be mechanisms to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. With that, over to Inge and then Keith.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you as well for all the work you did. Where are my possibilities as a politician to check, to control what's going on? We are now at the key point for political action and administrative action. That's why, in my view, this is a very important point for politicians, where I see if my programs do fly or not. Are there any possibilities to check foreseen? Thank you. Or could there be any procedures foreseen? Thanks.
Eileen, do you want to respond to that immediately?
I don't have any specific comments at this time, but it will definitely take that into consideration and feedback if there's any questions we have further on how to consider this. I'll pass it over to Ian though, because it seems like he put up his hand.
Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I think Inge raises a very important point, and actually, I think this is where this standard will address a lot of the appropriations that are made, and that comes into the purpose that the program is given for. And I think a lot of the practical points that Rosa has raised then come in, because the sort of controls that you have over the delivery of the program, I think, will then be the assurance that you need as a parliamentarian in terms of has this money been used for the purposes? Because you can distinguish between just a general transfer, where maybe you transfer an amount, a general subsidy to a different level of government, to a particular program where you're really trying to implement a clear set of objectives. And then I think what we're trying to do here is provide guidance that will, if you use the guidance in this way, it will demonstrate against the agreement, if the agreement's drawn the right way, that the money is being used for what the agreement is there to provide. And I think that's, that does come back to those practical concerns that Rosa was raising. So I think your point about the politician's perspective, absolutely right. And then it's about is it a general scheme or is it a specific scheme, and does this report on the specific schemes in terms of supporting that accountability.
Thanks, Ian, for responding to that. Over to Key, and then I think Kevin probably wants to come in at the same point, like Inge. Key.
Thanks, Thomas. Firstly, I think the proposed response gives a good perspective to address the concerns. Emphasizing the transfer provider perspective may help to promote the categories to better address public interest concerns. For example, from the transfer provider perspective, transfer expenses with performance obligation which benefit the third parties, and the transfer expense without performance obligations but with present obligations, both contribute to the public interest. And when the transfer provider incurs transfer expense without performance obligation but with present obligations, most of the time the transfer provider still has the control of the transferred resource. The transfer provider has the right to withdraw the funds if the transfer recipient doesn't satisfy the binding arrangement for delay or unqualified output. It's almost the same situation with the transfer expense with performance obligations. So we maybe should rethink in transfer provider perspective that whether distinguishing the two transfer expenses above and adopting a different recognition and measurement approaches for them is appropriate or not. Besides, the effects to consolidated financial statements needs to be considered. If transfer recipient and the transfer provider belong to the same public entity, when an inflow of resource arises from a transaction without performance obligations, but with present obligation, the transfer recipient recognize a liability other than revenue for any unsatisfied present obligations in respect of the inflow resources, but transfer provider recognize the expense immediately when the resources is transferred to the recipient, even if the transfer recipient satisfy the present obligation in binding arrangement. So when we prepare the consolidated financial statements, it's difficult for us to offset the expense of transfer provider and the liability of transfer recipient. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. That's helpful. Thank you for that. Kevin, as a last remark.
Yes, I support the focus. I think from a citizen vantage point, I think citizens would want the provider to have the final say when we're dealing with binding arrangements. I think as well, citizens might be surprised that with respect to transfers, how little of the overall transfers that are provided in federations with strong government, private sector relationships are actually binding in nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. That's helpful. So with that, Eileen, do you have any last remarks regarding the issue?
No final remarks, just a thank you to all CAG members for your feedback today. This is definitely really helpful just to guide us in the right direction and to know that, again, it's not a silver bullet, but it's a good starting point to make sure we can address all of the issues that have been brought up by constituents on transfer expenses, and also consider the practicality points that members have mentioned. So just echoing again, thank you very much, and we'll definitely be bringing this to the board.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Eileen, for that. I think in summary, we can say we heard a lot of support for the first the analysis for the connection to the root causes and for the proposed solution. I think we heard that from a feasibility, practicability standpoint. We heard that also from the perspective of avoiding to apply a perspective which is not the preparer's perspective, but somebody else's perspective. So I think it is very encouraging. I heard some comments regarding the potential problems in preparing consolidated financial statements and avoiding unnecessary elimination differences. But on the other side, I think we heard also a warning if there are trade-offs and benefits for not slavishly following the mirroring. I think we should follow that and consider that as well. And in the end, deal with the elimination differences which arose. I think we heard some warning regarding there might be in the end situations where the PSPOA approach doesn't make any sense again or anymore, because there are only a few transactions being left, which then would fall into this cluster. So I think that's certainly something which we should look at. And I think members were quite relieved, Eileen, when you said that changing the perspective is not, as you said, the silver bullet, is not solving all issues, and the board and the staff is quite aware that there are more critical and detailed issues to be solved and to be looked at in more detail. But overall, I think support for the direction of where you're heading to, and I think that's very, very good. So thank you for all the contributions to the CAG members. With that, I think we are reaching the end of the agenda from a content perspective, and I would just leave some minutes or some 1 minute for all non-members to leave the meeting so that we can have the last 5 minutes as a private session. Thank you again for everybody. Thanks for staff and for the technical director and the board chair for attending. As always, well prepared and great basis for discussion. And then see you all tomorrow in the board meeting